This upcoming weekend, the streets of Sin City will once again be taken over by Formula 1, and while it will be the 4th race in the city of Las Vegas, it will only be the 2nd on the actual streets. Formula 1's final stateside race will be on the Moomin-shaped course that is smack in the middle of town, and will incorporate part of the Las Vegas Strip as a portion of that layout, with cars flying past some of the city's most famous casinos, and, as you might have seen in various news articles, annoying local business owners, because they say that the track is getting in the way. But before the streets of Las Vegas was the car park of Las Vegas. Literally, the race was in a car park. The Caesars Palace Grand Prix was not, like it was this year and last year, the third of 3 races held within the United States. Issues surrounding the hosting of the Watkins Glen event meant that the track was added later on, as the Watkins Glen circuit had run into financial issues that the state of New York was not willing to bail them out of. So Bernie held talks with the relevant people in Nevada to get a circuit built in Vegas, which was something that had been on the radar for a short time. Now, I have done a video on the history of the circuit, so I won't bore you too much with all the details of how it came to be, because why do that when you can have another video to watch? So today is about one of the events that took place. Because back in 1981, the Caesars Palace circuit played host to a championship finale, a championship showdown, a showdown that was a lot closer than the 2024 one is being made out to be. The 1981 season was this world tour bookended by neighbouring circuits, Long Beach and Vegas being in neighbouring states and 300 miles apart. And the 1981 season was a 15-round championship. The South African Grand Prix was non-championship thanks to the fallout over the FISA-FOCA war, a very interesting piece of F1 history if you're not that familiar with it. And if you are new here, it just so happens that I've done quite literally some videos on the whole affair, which might tell you all that you need to know. But it wasn't just Kyalami and Watkins Glen that were moved, altered or outright cancelled, because the Brazilian Grand Prix had moved to Jacarapagua because Interlagos was deemed unsafe, and it and the race in Argentina were pushed back. Kyalami was supposed to be the venue that opened the season, but because of its status as a non-championship round, it meant that Long Beach would be the season opener at an official level. That 1981 South African Grand Prix was only attended by the FOCA-aligned teams, and again, if you watch my videos on the FISA-FOCA war, you'll learn more about FISA and FOCA and the different alliances that were in play. So basically, there were no rules. Because it was non-championship, they didn't have to run to the FIA's rulebook, so they could run whatever they want. The cars that ran in that race were many illegal. They had skirts, they had aero that they shouldn't have, they tuned the engines beyond what they would normally have. It was complete free-for-all. But this race will come back around later on, so hold on to the South African Grand Prix somewhere in your memory bank for a few minutes. Reutemann in the Williams had won that non-championship race in South Africa, but when the season proper got underway in California, it was Reutemann's teammate and reigning champion Alan Jones that took the first place honours, with Carlos taking the win in Brazil and then Piquet getting revenge at Reutemann's home race in Argentina. Piquet had actually finished 12th in Rio and 2 laps down, thanks to it lashing down and Piquet being on a dry setup while everybody else was on a wet setup. But it wasn't the only bit of drama that weekend, because in this race Brabham was rumoured to be having a trick suspension setup that allowed them to run the car's ride height lower than deemed legal, while on track that is, and allowing for better ground effect. The rules had changed this year to raise the ride height to produce less downforce, but Bernie Ecclestone's team had supposedly found a way around those rules. On top of this, Jones was expecting Reutemann to let him through due to Carlos's contractual number 2 status, but it never happened. Carlos won the race ahead of Jones, and AJ was so pissed off that he didn't attend the podium ceremony, with Riccardo Patrese being the only person on the podium to spray the champagne. There's 2 conflicting reports that you'll read with this particular race. The first is that Carlos wasn't spraying the champagne out of guilt or embarrassment over what had happened with AJ, and he really wasn't in the mood to do any spraying of the champagne despite winning the Grand Prix. Or it's because that at the time Williams was sponsored by a Saudi airline, and because of Saudi Arabia's approach to alcohol and it being outlawed in Saudi Arabia, they didn't want to spray it to keep the sponsors happy, but I don't know. So this is the sort of season we're dealing with. Other points of note include a driver joining the grid by the name of Slim Borgood, and while he sounds like somebody that might receive letters saying things like, "I wrote you but you still ain't calling, I left my cell, my pager and my home phone at the bottom," he was actually usually found playing drums for Swedish pop royalty ABBA, with the band's logo being put on his car. And while ABBA wasn't paying cash to ATS to sponsor the team, it was hoped that the exposure would bring more investors. Lotus later on brought the 88, the twin chassis car, but it was banned before it could race, which pissed off Colin Chapman royally. I've done a video on that car as well, if you're interested. By the end of the Brazilian Grand Prix, the Williams drivers were out in front, but Piquet and Brabham bounced back with Piquet winning in Argentina and then won again in San Marino. But then Nelson would suffer 3 consecutive retirements in Zolder, Monaco and Spain, with the Spanish Grand Prix back on the calendar after some years away. Reutemann would get big points at Zolder, where he won, but would then retire in Monaco and then be 4th in Spain, while Piquet got back into scoring ways in France, where he was 3rd and Carlos no scored. So after the halfway point of the season, the scores were as follows. Reutemann had an 11-point lead over Piquet at this point, and it should be noted that in these days it was 9 points for a win, so Piquet would need to win twice with Reutemann no scoring to get into the lead of the championship, although he could get a low point scoring position with Reutemann no scoring, but really if you want to win the championship you need to be winning races. Jones was in 3rd on 24, and then just behind him was Gilles Villeneuve in the Ferrari, with Ferrari having quite a rough time in 1981. Then it was Jacques Laffite for Ligier in 5th on 17 points. Reutemann managed to get some points on Piquet at Silverstone, then the fastest race on the calendar, and Piquet crashed heavily in that race and had to be taken away from the circuit by ambulance because he'd injured his legs. Piquet would then win in Germany at the old Hockenheim. He basically won the engine not blowing up lottery that the old Hockenheim was, and the old Hockenheim showed the gulf in power between the turbos and non-turbos, as Prost's Renault was nearly a full second ahead of 3rd place Reutemann. Funnily enough, Piquet's engine had survived, while Carlos's had exploded. Piquet left Montreal just 1 point behind Reutemann, but it wasn't just those two, because with a very outside chance of taking the title was Jacques Laffite in the Ligier, and if the Williams and Brabham cars retired at Caesar's Palace, then he could take an unlikely title. Prost and Jones were well out of it in 4th and 5th, equal on points but Prost ahead on countback, with Jones going to have his final Formula 1 race in Nevada. At the same time, there were rumours that 1978 champion Mario Andretti was also going to leave Formula 1, and Niki Lauda had been spotted testing a McLaren, leading to rumours of a comeback. Williams had won the Constructors' title and done so by a decent margin. They had 86 points after the Canadian Grand Prix, with Brabham on 59 and Renault on 48. Ligier could overhaul Renault at Las Vegas if the Renaults did their almost customary engine explosion and fireworks show, and Ferrari was way down in 5th on 34 points. But with just 1 point in it, the championship showdown would be at one of the most uninspiring and dull circuits in the world. The Caesars Palace circuit had been dumped in the middle of a car park. And I don't mean calling it a car park because there was 997 miles of runoff on every corner Herman Tilke modern track meme car park. It was the actual car park for the Caesars Palace Hotel and Casino. Since the early 80s this has all been built on and the car park no longer exists, but we can use the magic of Sony Vegas to superimpose the track map over the modern complex. Sort of. I mean, it's not exact, but yeah, it'll do. It was a kart track, and it's not just me calling it that, the drivers called it that. And because it was in such an open area, the sun was going to be blaring down on the place, and the track had been laid out in such a way that it was just switchback hairpin after switchback hairpin. So a kart track. Motorsport magazine at the time described it as being a point and squirt affair laid out between unyielding concrete barriers. Like Harama, but without the ups and downs. It was designed to be a TV-centric circuit, and all those hairpins managed to get the track to be just over 2¼ miles. I'm also yet to find somebody who drove it that enjoyed it. It was also, somehow, exempt from a rule that said that all new circuits have to host a pilot event before Formula 1 can go there. If Laffite wanted the title, he needed to win the race with Reutemann lower than 4th and Piquet lower than 3rd. In doing so, Laffite would have won the title on a 3-way tie. They'd all have 52 points, but Laffite would have won the same amount of races as Piquet, but would have had more second places. For Piquet to beat Reutemann, he had to outscore him by finishing 5th or higher. Not only was the circuit perfectly smooth and exploiting the ground effect to its maximum because there weren't that many bumps to break the seal that the ground effect needs to produce the downforce, if you follow me, the lap speeds were averaging north of 100 miles an hour. And because it was anti-clockwise as well, which is something the drivers don't really train for, and also going to be hotter than the surface of the sun, it meant that the drivers were not going to be in for a very fun time. That said though, qualifying was pretty cool, in terms of temperature that is, not that it was interesting, and Reutemann got half the job done by securing pole position ahead of his teammate. Villeneuve helped the two Williams cars out by slotting in between them and Piquet's Brabham, with the rest of the top 10 being Prost, Watson, Tombe, Giacomelli, Mansell and Andretti. Down at the dusty end of the grid in the non-qualifiers, don't be fooled by the fact that there's a Jacques Villeneuve there, something that confused people on last year's video. That Jacques Villeneuve is a Jacques Villeneuve. It's Gilles' brother. It's not the Jacques Villeneuve, the 1995 Carton Indy 500 winner, 1997 F1 World Champion, and singer-songwriter. But at some point in one of the practice-cum-qualifying sessions, Reutemann had actually collided with Piquet after misjudging a gap trying to overtake him, and in doing so, he'd messed the car up in such a way that he might have bent the suspension, or at least knackered his gearbox. But the circuit as a whole was taking its toll on the drivers. Piquet was having neck and back issues and needed to get help from Sugar Ray Leonard's physio to try and get the problems massaged out, and the drivers were getting lost in the switchbacks, so much so that signs had to be put up in places not only for the drivers, but to allow people watching at home to know exactly where on the track they were looking. But eventually, the race got going, and the race was going to be hot. Very hot. Gilles Villeneuve was disqualified for starting out of position, something that the clerk of the course was taking very, very seriously, but he didn't get the message until a lot later. Jones didn't seem to care much for his teammates' championship aspirations and took the lead at the first corner, leaving Carlos to be swamped by Villeneuve, who hadn't been told he'd been disqualified yet, Prost and Giacomelli. In fact, Jones later said, "I don't see how I can help him. I would not go holding people up because I'm a member of the British Commonwealth and I would consider that unsporting." In just half a mile or so, Carlos was down to 5th and was now going to be under attack from Watson, Lafitte and Piquet. Jones meanwhile had naffed off into a 2-second lead, and then there was a massive shunt involving Patrick Tambay and Andrea de Cesaris, with Tambay slamming into the concrete wall so hard he was lucky to walk away with his legs intact. Still not being told that he'd been disqualified, Villeneuve was holding everybody up. Jones was going quickly, but Villeneuve was also slow, and that was helping AJ out more than his pace was. Eventually, Prost got by the Canadian, but everything had shuffled to the point where Reutemann had Piquet behind him, and whoever finished ahead would be the champion. But not only did Carlos have the practice smash with Nelson, his gearbox was playing up too. Piquet took the position from Reutemann on lap 17, throwing it up the inside of the final corner in what was described as a well-executed move given what was at stake. If it hadn't come off, then both of them would have been out, and Reutemann would have won the title by default. Villeneuve had now been told that he'd been disqualified, but Ferrari couldn't bring him in because he'd crashed on lap 21. Ferrari was debating whether to appeal or bring him in, but Gilles decided that for them. Lafitte took 3rd from Giacomelli, but then Giacomelli spun his Alfa Romeo, which allowed Andretti, Piquet and Watson to move up a spot. Reutemann was now out of the points. Despite being flat and without many bumps that allowed the ground effect to be used to its maximum, it was abrasive, and the Michelins that the Renaults were using weren't having a fun time out there. Prost had to pit for some new rubber and got sent on his way, and Lafitte dropped down the order when the French driver, in the French car with the French engine and the French tyres, had to do the same. Andretti then dropped out with suspension problems, but Giacomelli was catching Prost, and it was going to be interesting to see if Prost could be caught. At the same time, Watson was being caught by Lafitte, but Watson was catching Piquet, so despite the crap layout of the track, it was providing some tension for this championship finale. With a few laps left, AJ was out in front by nearly 20 seconds, but the battle was for second place. Giacomelli was definitely catching Prost and might be able to take second, but overtaking was proving tricky. Behind, Mansell had got his Lotus up to 4th in the melee with the pit stops and the drivers dropping out through retirements. Piquet was in 5th and on for the title as it stood, while Reutemann was in 8th. But Piquet was suffering. He and Mansell were suffering from cramp, neck pain, back pain, and Mansell's seat hadn't been fitted properly, which wasn't helping him either. But after 75 scorching, tedious laps, it was over. Jones took the victory in his last F1 race, leading from turn 1 and never looking back. Prost held on to take second, just half a second or so from Giacomelli, while Mansell was in no man's land in 4th. Further back, Piquet held on by a narrow margin to finish just ahead of Lafitte's Ligier, with Watson 7th, Reutemann 8th, Pironi's Ferrari 9th, and Keke Rosberg, who had struggled to make the grid for most of the season, rounding out the top 10 before he switched to Williams to replace Jones. Jones was confident enough to get out of the car and walk to the podium with a cold beer in his hands like a proper Aussie. Piquet, meanwhile, was suffering from heat exhaustion and struggled to get out of the car, and for about 15 minutes after getting out of the car, he was struggling to walk. It's interesting to note then that had the South African Grand Prix results been taken into account, and the 9 points that Reutemann would have got for that race been added to his tally, Reutemann would have won the title. There are some suggestions out there that Carlos's car was sabotaged because of what happened in Brazil, especially given that Carlos had moved aside for Jones at Long Beach, only for him to not return the favour at Jacarapagua. But mechanical failures happened all the time in those days. Losing gears was common, and Carlos had crashed into Piquet in practice, so it might have been one of those things that's just a urban myth. If anything, Reutemann lost the title at Hockenheim, because there Jones's car had blown up, so Williams gave him Reutemann's car or some of Reutemann's equipment, while Reutemann got brand new stuff out of the engine pool or something along those lines, only for Reutemann's car to then blow up. But I can't see Williams deliberately sabotaging somebody's driver's title for something that happened nearly 9 months before. But it's as close as Reutemann would get to a title. After just a couple of rounds of the 1982 season, he would be gone from Formula 1. It's said that being an Argentine driver living in Britain and driving for a British team while Argentina was fighting with the British over the Falklands wasn't a good look for anybody, and he decided to leave, although that's an urban myth as well. He went back to Argentina and went into politics with the Justicialist Party. I think that's how it's pronounced, but it's a centre-right leaning party where he became the governor for Santa Fe in 1991. The Caesars Palace circuit would host one more event in Formula 1, the 1982 race being won by Michele Alboreto in a Tyrrell, but by this point the circuit was done. The venue was impossibly tight and unedifying and was doing nothing to excite drivers and fans, with not many people turning up to the races to start with. And speaking of 1982, we've looked at the Pironi-Villeneuve situation in the past, but what we really need to look at is the overall outcome of that season, where the guy in the fourth best car won the title. It's a story I should probably do in the future, isn't it? It did host kart for a couple more years, with the circuit turned into a flat oval, and then it was covered over later on by the Mirage Casino and the Forum shops. But over 40 years later, with the new Vegas on the calendar, Formula 1 is starting to embrace this failed endeavour in the US, and kind of serving as one of the many attempts to try and replace the loved Watkins Glen. So then, a look at the 1981 finale and how with just one race not going official, somebody else won the title. If this has been a fun look through the history books, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job, and for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else to do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help pay the bills around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know, such as affiliate links and other stuff, with there being some offers on the F1 store right now. Terms and conditions apply and all of that. There's also memberships down there, and super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.